This big boy, I mean big, it's heavy, is the Nordmende Globetraveler 2. It's a fine example of German engineering of portables that were issued in the 1960s. Beautiful transistorized radio. And it's heavy, as did I mention it was heavy? So let's have a look at the features of this radio. What attracted me to portable radios made in West Germany in the 1960s was the attention to the quality of sound. Bass response always seemed greater than what you thought was possible for the size of the radio. So let's start by looking at the frequency coverage of the Globetraveler. You can probably hear that familiar tone of WWV. That's on 15 megahertz. As you can see, this is a separate dial that's on this radio, just for specific broadcast bands, and there's the name of the band that's currently being used. Not an overly sensitive radio compared to what you would get in today's market, but you know, this is nostalgic listening. I think back in the 60s, before shortwave went on the internet and left the airwaves, that these bands would have been a lot more alive and full. So you change bands just by turning this dial. And there's 25 meters. Now, one of the problems is, you might hear this. There's a radio station. Particularly on this one. If you've got FM stations nearby, that's the kind of interference that you'll hear, because the front end doesn't have any kind of low-pass filter on it. Again, compared to today's standards, this radio it couldn't hold up to it in terms of sensitivity, selectivity, and image rejection, and so on. This band spread dial, internally in the radio, when you're doing the renovation or the restoration, is an absolute nightmare to get at. I think what happens is they align it, pre-assemble it, and then drop it in as a block into the radio. But once it's in the radio, getting it out again to do any kind of alignment would be near impossible. So you have to do all the alignment in the radio itself. But of course, this is to me, the most important part of the radio is the band spread dials. The other bands are not important, particularly long wave, which is non-existent in North America in terms of broadcasts. There are maybe a few non-directional beacons left that you can listen to from airports. This one is called the Marine Band, believe it or not, because that used to be used most heavily for ship-to-shore communications. And it goes up to just at the bottom end of the 80-meter ham band, and just down at the other end to the top end of the broadcast band. And of course you have standard broadcast AM right here. Up at the top here you have the band selection buttons. Essentially this is automatic frequency control for the FM band, which you'd select with this button. This is a narrow or wide filter, and I find that when it's out, its sensitivity on shortwave is very low, so I just leave it pressed in. I'm not sure if it's wide or narrow in that position. This is the button you'd use to select the band spread bands, the shortwave bands. This is the marine band mentioned earlier. Used to be used for marine communications. This is the AM broadcast or medium wave, and the long wave. Now the FM band is pretty nice on this radio. And with all bands you get on the S meter, you do get a signal strength indication for each station. And if you're not quite tuned in properly, the FM AFC button will certainly hold the FM station in. And over on the left side of the radio you have volume control. you have a bass control and a treble control. Now the bass control also, if you push it, and we'll demonstrate that in a separate shot, it will turn on the lighting in the radio so you can read the dial in the dark. And also up here on the S meter, you can get a battery check just by pressing the treble button. Taking a look at the side panel on this radio. At the top you have kind of what I consider a non-standard antenna connection. It's kind of a pain because trying to find plugs that fit that is probably near impossible at this point. So you just stick a couple of wires in there and then connect that to your coax or whatever external antenna type you're using. Here's a DIN plug, and that's quite common on radios of this era for both recording off of the radio and playing something back through the radio from another source, like a tape, for instance. Here's a speaker connection. Sorry, no, this is the speaker connection. This is DC input. It's the standard barrel type connector, and it's negative in the center, and the outside of the barrel is positive. So these use positive ground rather than negative ground like most radios. Again, speaker or headphones. And this one gave me a lot of trouble. This is an AC connection, and I had trouble with the power supply when I got this from the person I bought it from on eBay, and I ended up abandoning it and going with an external 7.5 volt supply, running it from here. This has a little switch built into it, so that when you plug in the AC cord, it cuts out the battery supply. But the switch in there is very intermittent, and I just frankly couldn't be bothered with it. So the power supply on this radio, I've totally bypassed. Most of the time I leave the batteries in, but we'll run it off of the 7.5 volt adapter from time to time. If you're using that 7.5 volt DC input on the side of the radio, or you're running off of AC, when you turn the radio on, it does light up the dial. And as you change bands, let's say for instance you go to the shortwave bands, it'll light up the shortwave broadcast band strip there. Any other band, such as FM or marine band, broadcast, long wave, it'll light up this area of the dial. If you're operating off of batteries and you push the treble button down, it'll light up the band spread strip here. Any other band, by pushing that same button, it will light up this entire dial area here. So that's a means of preserving battery life so that the lights aren't on all the time unless you need to suddenly spot check what frequency you're on. This radio operates off of AC or from batteries. And here there's a selector for 220 or 110 volts. And believe it or not, some people actually put these in their car, and there's a car adapter behind this plug. Fuse is up here, and this is a battery compartment. Contains 5 D cells, I believe. And that's enough to give it 7.5 volts, which is an odd voltage, but that's what a lot of German radios in that time period, in the late 60s, whatever, used as their standard voltage. So 5 cells gives you 7.5 volts. One of the things I absolutely hate about this radio is the handle. It's one of those that has the 2 little screw slots, and if you drop the handle down, it will just fall off. It's really meant for just carrying the radio, and it will do that. But if you aren't careful, that can happen. So this is the Allied Electronics catalog from 1968, and this young guy here was building this Night Kit Star Roamer with his dad, and I actually had one of those that I built probably just a year or so prior to this catalog, the age of this catalog. But the interesting thing that relates to this video is this very dog-eared page 105. I must have visited it so many times because I was drooling over these radios. And what's here but a Nordmende? This is the Globetraveler, so that's the one that must have come out just prior to the one I have here. It says it's a 15-band radio, and it looks very similar. It's got this similar buttons, but they're round, a smaller S meter on it, and the buttons over here are rearranged. But I think it also has the bands that will cover band spread on shortwave, and that's, I think, what these bands up here are for. But there it is also, and it says it plays from the car battery with an optional mount, which I pointed out earlier. I hope you enjoyed your tour of the Nordmende Globetraveler. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.